Go ahead, try to sue me if you think you've got what it takes. I'm a military veteran who got injured in Iraq, and I mention that because it's relevant to the story. I worked for this guy who owned a few businesses in a small town. He was the wealthiest man around, but it wasn't some big company, just a few local ventures he ran. It's important to explain how I ended up in this situation, so bear with me while I get to the meat and potatoes of it. I joined the military before finishing high school due to a late birthday. I chose a path that I thought I'd enjoy. I became a mechanic because I've always loved working on things. Plus, the sign-on bonus was pretty sweet. During basic training, I only spent on what I needed, so I saved up a lot. By the time I finished advanced training for my military specialty, I had half my bonus and almost a year's pay sitting in the bank. Most people my age would have blown it all, but I was smarter about it. I invested in the stock market, dabbled in Bitcoin, and even paid off my parents' house. A few deployments later, I had the rest of my bonus, and the only big thing I ever bought was a hot rod. So I ended up with a good chunk of money saved and invested. By the time I was discharged, even after a rough divorce, I was still pretty comfortable. Don't get me wrong, I didn't have stupid money, but I was doing all right. The divorce took a toll on my stocks, and if you've followed Bitcoin in the last couple of decades, you know how volatile that can be. After the split, I focused on recovering what I lost and staying busy. I loved being a mechanic, so I just bounced around, taking jobs wherever I felt like, knowing a good mechanic could find work anywhere. After about 10 years, I decided it was time to settle down, and I picked a quiet little town called Marlow, Oklahoma. I was tired of working on other people's cars all the time and wanted to spend more time on my own. I bought a small house, and when I spotted a help wanted sign at the local lube shop, I thought, why not? It was simple work and would cover my bills. When I grabbed an application, the locals gave me all kinds of funny looks. For reference, I'm 6'3", and ever since leaving the military, I let my hair grow out, stopped shaving, and got a full sleeve tattoo. People usually cross the street instead of walking past me. I went to turn in my application to the bookkeeper, Jessica. She noticed that I was a veteran and marked a Y on my form. Later that day, she called and asked if I'd come back in to meet the owner. Let's call him Mike. She said he'd be in about an hour and we could chat about the job. When I got there, Mike's eyes practically popped out when he saw me, but we got to talking and I guess my southern charm won him over. He handed me a calendar featuring his car collection and asked me to name the ones I recognized. There were a few Mustangs, a Ford GT, a Bricklin SV1, a Judge, a Demon, a Pantera, and an MXT. He was impressed that I knew what the SV1 was, and we bonded over our shared love of cars. He offered me the job and explained the deal. $100 a day, working Monday to Saturday from 8 to 6, no overtime. I'd get a full day's pay even if we closed early, and I could eat whenever I had time. Sundays were always off, plus one extra day during the week. Things started great, and I worked there for about a year with no issues. Then Mike asked if I'd be willing to help out at his other lube shops in nearby towns, giving the regular guys some time off. He said he'd toss in an extra $20 a day for travel. I agreed and did that for about another year. But then disaster struck. Mike met Lisa, and within a month they were married. He started funding her gambling habit, and that's when the problems began. One week, I noticed my paycheck was only $250, so I asked Jessica about it. She told me there had been some changes, and I'd need to speak to Mike. No big deal. I called Mike, and he showed up with Lisa. When I asked why my pay was short, he said it was because bad weather forced early closures, hurting the business. I was willing to let it go because Mike had always been a good guy, but then Lisa chimed in, saying, "It's not fair to us to pay you for a full day when you don't work the full 10 hours. I pointed out that my pay was on a daily rate, not hourly, which was why I didn't get paid overtime for all the extra hours each week. She snapped back, claiming that wasn't how things worked anymore, and that I'd only be paid for the hours I actually worked. I just thought, whatever you say, Lisa. Fast forward to the next week, and we had a series of very busy days. We stayed open a couple of hours later than usual to handle all the waiting customers, and I even gave up one of my days off to cover for a coworker who was out sick. So, when my paycheck, which should have been over $800, came in at only $600, I had some questions. I called up Mike and asked why my pay was short. He shrugged and said, "Well, that's what we agreed on, $100 a day." I stared at him, a bit baffled, and asked if he'd forgotten about the extra hours last week. He just shrugged and said, "It is what it is." I was already feeling pretty aggravated when Lisa walked in and said, "What's he complaining about now?" I looked at her coldly and said, "Well, I worked 80 hours last week and you all only paid me $600. She shot back, "You're contracted labor and you agreed to $100 per day, so why would we pay you more than that?" I turned to Mike and asked if that was really how things were going to be. He just nodded and said, "You heard the lady." I went home telling myself that I was only working to cover my living expenses anyway, and that the job wasn't that hard. The only other options in this small town were assembling sheds or slinging chickens at the processing plant. The next week, one of the guys I worked with got chewed out by Lisa in front of customers over what she claimed was an OSHA violation. She said that as part owner, it was her job to make sure all OSHA rules were followed. His supposed violation? Wearing tinted safety glasses. That was ridiculous because the shop bays faced east-west, so workers got blasted by the sun during the day, and pit workers like me got it in the evening. As I walked by, shaking my head, Lisa noticed and yelled, "Got something to say, you big baby?" I just kept walking. I pulled Jessica aside and told her she needed to have a serious talk with Mike before Lisa's mouth wrote checks he'd have to cash. She just shrugged and said, "I just keep the books, don't involve me." This nonsense went on for another year, and I was finally at my breaking point. The day I started my malicious compliance, I was in a terrible mood. I woke up to the news that a good friend of mine, the one responsible for me surviving an explosion in Iraq, had been killed by a drunk driver. Not wanting to deal with anyone, I told the shop I'd be working in the pit all day and to leave me alone. The guys knew something was up. They'd been working with me for years and could tell I was not myself. I never expected to see Lisa that day since I was at the furthest shop, on the opposite side of town from her usual casino trips. But luck wasn't on my side. Mike and Lisa showed up and she stormed into the pit, yelling, "Mike, come look at this mess." I had no clue what she was talking about. I kept my pig spotless and always cleaned as I worked, unlike some who waited until the end of the day. She was mad about 50 of our most common oil filters stacked on the waste drums for easy access, a setup Mike had known about for ages and never had a problem with. Mike walked in, looked around, and in a patronizing tone said, "Clean up this pigsty." I glared at him and said, "Today's not the day, Mike. Move on and take her with you." That sent Lisa into a rage. She thought it was the height of disrespect toward her and Mike. He told me that if I didn't like it, I was free to leave, so I did. But don't worry, this story isn't over yet. This was just the first flap of the butterfly's wings that set off a massive storm. The next day, Mike called me and asked me to swing by the main shop on my way home. I thought he was going to apologize for what happened, maybe after hearing from the other guys about why I was so on edge. But no, that wasn't the case at all. Mike called me in to inform me that I was being put on probation for the next 6 months due to my behavior and would only be paid $50 a day. I'd also lose the $20 travel allowance for going to the other shops. I asked if he was serious and if he'd really thought this through. That's when Mike's true colors showed. He told me I was lucky I wasn't fired for my constant disrespect toward him and co-owner Lisa. He said that if he didn't pity me for being a struggling disabled veteran, which by the way I never once discussed with anyone at work, he would have fired me long ago. I guess he assumed I was broke and desperate just by looking at me. Something inside me snapped, and I started laughing. Mike asked what I found so funny, and I stood tall, stepping up to him like a drill sergeant ready to lay down the law. I told him, "You should reconsider your life choices and who you go into business with." Mike sneered and said, "What, you gonna sue me or something? Go ahead if you think you can afford it. What do you get from the VA, like $1,000 a month? I know how bad you need this job." That wasn't my plan, but it triggered my malicious compliance instincts, and once a soldier, always a soldier, so I went to war. That day, I called a labor lawyer, paid the $3,000 retainer, and kicked off a lawsuit for an unsafe work environment, unpaid overtime, and minimum wage violations. I kept working for Mike, and it was glorious, but I still wanted more. It took about 6 months of my probation for the lawyer to get all the paperwork together and filed. I told him to slow roll it, and since he was a former Marine, I think he had an idea of what I was up to. When everything was ready, my lawyer filed the lawsuit, and Mike and Lisa were served at the main shop while I was working. They read through the papers, and my lawyer's process server stuck around to witness what I knew was coming. When Mike and Lisa realized I was suing them, they flipped out. Mike shouted, "I should kick your ass, you ungrateful piece of shit." And Lisa screamed, "You're fired, you coward. I bet you weren't even really in the military." The process server recorded the whole thing and handed it over to my lawyer, who added unlawful termination to the lawsuit, since firing someone for suing is illegal. The next day, I opened my own lube shop and car wash combo, and I started recruiting my former coworkers at higher pay plus commission. They were eager to join the lawsuit, and my lawyer was happy to add them to it. 2 years later, after subpoenas for security footage, financial records going back 5 years, and sworn testimonies, we finally went to mediation. Mike and Lisa offered a measly $50,000 to split between the 15 of us, which didn't even cover the unpaid overtime. We declined. And then our Apache helicopter swooped in to save the day. Sent by the IRS and delivered to my lawyer, the documents were related to our request for the company's tax records. Mike had cleverly set up each lube shop as its own LLC, with separate tax IDs and employment records. Thinking they were slick, Mike and Lisa filed for a tax credit for employing a veteran at each of their 6 shops. They claimed I was a full-time employee working at least 36 hours a week at $12 an hour to get tax breaks for hiring a veteran. At the next mediation, my lawyer laid this information in front of their lawyer and the mediator. After a quick 20-minute discussion, Mike and Lisa returned, agreeing to our demand of $400,000 in unpaid overtime to be split among the 15 of us, all legal fees, and a personal settlement for unlawful termination of $20,000 per shop, where I was listed as an employee. They also paid unpaid wages for the 6 months I was only earning $5 an hour. Their one condition was that we all agree to a gag order, keeping everything confidential. Of course, we signed and took our payouts, but somehow their tax paperwork landed in the hands of just the right person at the IRS, and they were soon under investigation for tax fraud. I sold my shop to the guys who had joined the lawsuit. They each paid me $8,000, and I washed my hands of the whole ordeal. I put my house up for sale and moved away. About 8 months later, I went back to deal with an overgrown lawn at my old house. The guy who was supposed to handle it had been arrested, and the city was threatening to fine me $100 a day until the yard was up to code. So I went down to mow it myself. While I was there, I stopped by my realtor's office to see about yard maintenance. Who do I see sitting at the front desk? Jessica, looking as content as could be. Jessica couldn't tell me fast enough about everything that had gone down. It was perfect. What I thought was just a small victory turned out to be an atom bomb. Mike had filed for bankruptcy, trying to avoid going completely broke after making a plea deal for probation on tax fraud charges and paying a fortune in back taxes. Lisa had taken off with some guy she met at a casino. I asked Jessica 2 questions. If she knew who reported the fraudulent tax documents to the IRS, and what happened to Mike's car collection. She said, "I have no idea," but suggested I check the parking lot behind the realtor's office on my way out. Sure enough, when I peeked behind the office, there sat a bright green Bricklin SV F1. Mike had started selling his cars early and cheap, hoping to buy them back after filing for bankruptcy. To this day, I don't know who, if anyone, actually reported the paperwork to the IRS. My best guess is that whoever was tasked with compiling it noticed something off and flagged it. However it happened, it couldn't have hit 2 more deserving people. Now on to the next story. Heartbreak and reflection, uncovering betrayal on our 10th wedding anniversary. Yesterday marked our 10-year wedding anniversary. Megan and I, both 35, have been married for a decade. Over the past few months, she's been deep in a significant work project. The past 4 weeks in particular have been intense, with her putting in extra hours, arriving early, and staying late to meet her deadline. This project could make or break her career. I work in construction, where our schedule is heavily influenced by the weather. When it rains, we miss time, so on clear days, we push hard 12-hour days, sometimes longer. If it's raining when I wake up, I don't go in, and some days we're sent home if the weather turns, as it's too risky to continue. I usually hit the gym for an hour or 2 on those days. This past Thursday, we started work at 6 a.m., but mid-morning the rain came down hard and we got sent home. As usual, I headed to the gym, but cut my workout short, deciding to surprise Megan downtown with some flowers and hopefully make dinner plans. We hadn't seen much of each other that week, with me going to bed around 9 p.m. while she was still at work, having called earlier to say she'd be late again. It wasn't unusual for this past month. I grabbed some flowers and arrived at her building around 12:30. Nickel, the receptionist, was at her desk. I mentioned I'd gotten there later than planned and asked if she could place the flowers on Megan's desk. Nickel suggested I drop them off myself, saying, "I don't think they've gone to lunch yet." She buzzed me through to the offices, which were deserted. I made my way to Megan's office. The door closed. Normally, I'd just walk in unless Nickel mentioned she was in a meeting. I opened the door, and there he was, some guy standing behind her, nuzzling her neck while she reached back, her hand over his head. She was giggling in that way only she can, saying, "We've got to get this done." The sight knocked the wind out of me. I slammed the flowers on her desk, muttered, "Happy anniversary," and walked out. I didn't hear her response, just walked past Nickel, said goodbye, and left. I made it to the elevators, then out of the building before my phone started ringing. I cried all the way home, pulled into the garage, grabbed my camping gear from the rafters and took off. I drove for about 2 hours to a state park. I had no idea what I was doing. I just needed to escape. I hiked a trail we'd walked before, a 3-hour hike, trying to clear my head. I don't drink much, so I had no alcohol with me. I just sat there, thinking. Looking back, I'm grateful I was in such a rush that I didn't bring my .45 caliber handgun, which I normally take camping. We have black bears in the area. They usually scare off, but can get aggressive if they're hungry or have cubs. Given how I was feeling, I might have done something reckless. My phone was blowing up with calls from Megan, so I turned it off. I eventually left the park to get reception and turned my phone back on, seeing that my good friend had called. I returned his call, and he said Megan had reached out to him, worried I might do something stupid. We talked for a bit, and I told him I needed to sort through this on my own and would catch up with him on Friday. As I tried to process everything, I reflected on our marriage from the beginning, wondering what I'd missed. We came from completely different backgrounds. My grandfather and mom raised me, teaching me about life. My grandpa had a saying for everything, and he used to tell me that marriage would be the hardest job I'd ever have, something that needed daily effort. God, I miss him. We didn't have much, and I often overheard Mom and Grandpa discussing bills, but they worked hard, and my brother and I never felt we were missing out on anything. Megan, on the other hand, was born into comfort. Not overly rich, but definitely well off. She attended a great college, always had the latest fashion, and drove a new car. And she's stunning, an 11 out of 10. I used to joke with her about the silver spoon getting stuck in her throat when she'd cough. When we met, we clicked immediately and started dating. I couldn't believe someone like her would be with me. We dated for a while before she told me about her parents and their lifestyle. Our friends called us the model couple, thinking we were too good-looking not to be models. Our families, however, were more skeptical, worried that the economic differences between us would cause problems. Her dad and I eventually got along, but it took some time for my mom to warm up. She graduated, got her first job, and we started planning our wedding. We made a pact to immerse ourselves in each other's worlds. She joined me for whitewater rafting while I went to the symphony with her. We tried ziplining, attended art openings, you name it, we did it. We agreed that we needed to embrace each other's interests. She genuinely enjoyed the physical activities, and I found myself liking the symphony and such. I even own 2 tuxes now. Looking back, I can't see any red flags. She left her first 2 jobs because men tried to get in her pants. They'd parade her in front of cameras for photo ops, invite her to conferences where other newbies weren't invited. At one conference dinner, a partner tried to get her drunk and then forced himself into her room that night. She quit. The same thing happened at her next job, so she left again. This third job, where some of the partners are women, doesn't have any of that nonsense, and she seemed really happy there. We seemed really happy. Now it's Friday, and I'm back home. I called her and asked where she was. Still at work. In a smart-ass mood, I commented that our marriage seemed to be taking a backseat to her job. She replied that since I wouldn't talk to her, what else was she supposed to do? Fair enough. She said she'd be home in an hour, so I waited. I want to save our marriage. If I've fallen short somehow, I want to fix it. Of course, I want to ask why she did it, but I can't accept an "I don't know" as an answer.